Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian. Few people in Washington national security circles are as respected as Michèle Flournoy for her strategic and policy savvy, her measured judgment, bipartisanship, as well as her ability to work well with uniformed, civilian, and political leaders. Flournoy has 3 decades of national security experience, including most recently as policy chief at the Pentagon. Now the CEO of the Center for a New American Security, Flournoy is considered a frontrunner to become the nation's first female defense secretary if Hillary Clinton wins the White House, but has not joined the campaign team. We sat down with Flournoy at CNAS for an exclusive interview on current and future threats, strategy, and managing one of the world's most complex organizations. In part 2 of our 3-part discussion, I asked Flournoy whether the United States over the coming 5 to 15 years would have to reconsider its long-term approach of depending on its allies. A lot of our global strategy, a fundamental pillar of our global strategy, is for the United States to rely on its allies. And in fact, some of the cuts we made are predicated on the fact that everything the United States does will be with its allies. But if you look at a lot of our allies, certainly in Europe, there was some improvement before this migration crisis, which is putting a strain on resources. You can look at it from a Brexit standpoint, that creates a little bit of economic uncertainty, that now people worry that European economies will come even under further pressure. You look at aging populations in Europe and also in Japan, for example, and how that plays out over time. Does the United States have to look, when you're looking 5, 10, 15 years out, where are our allies going to be and what kind of capacity are they going to have to be? And does that in turn force us to reconsider what we're doing fundamentally with our long-term defense planning?
You know, I do think we need our allies to be doing their fair share, but I think the narrative that they're all a bunch of free riders and they don't do their fair share and they're all a drain on the U.S. is highly erroneous. You look in Europe, you have France stepping up to take much more of a global role in counterterrorism. You have the new German white paper that talks about much more of a leadership role for Germany. And look at the sustained contributions they've made in a place like Afghanistan, which nobody ever would have believed 10 years ago. Britain has committed to rebuilding its defense. I mean, so the Baltics, the frontline states that are facing Russia, they are sustaining a healthy defense investment. So, you know, it is not all bad news that we have allies that are stepping up. I do worry about the level of internal preoccupation that Europe is understandably going through at the moment between Brexit and with the EU, the migrant crisis, terrorism, and so forth. But I do see a number of our allies still very committed to contributing into the best of their ability. You look to Asia, and you have Japan stepping up, you have South Korea stepping up, you have many of the ASEAN states stepping up, I think Australia, for goodness sake, a fabulous ally. I mean, there's a lot of good news story that's been sort of lost in the current campaign rhetoric. That said, you know, I think the U.S. will almost always fight in coalition, but there are unique things that we will have to provide that only we will be able to provide, and we need to make sure we make the investments to do that.
Briefly about Brexit, you know, do you have a concern, as some do, that Britain, which has historically been a global power, that its entire bandwidth will be consumed with minding and unwinding from the EU, then in turn will take its attention off of some global problems at a very time when British leadership will be very important?
I think there's going to be a lot of leadership attention trying to sort out how to actually implement this without dire effects for the British economy. That said, I do believe that, you know, when British interests are threatened, they'll still show up to be a good NATO ally, and they'll still show up to be a good U.S. ally when needed. That's their history, almost no matter what they've gone through. So I believe that will still be the case.
Does it make, in a sense, France more important from a Washington perspective, given that France is a leading, you know, Europe has always been seen as having sort of 2 leading defense states, Britain and France. Both of them are EU members. Does the fact that Britain is leaving the EU, which was one way that we would communicate and, you know, just a historic conduit for us, does France now become more important in terms of it being, you know, remaining an EU?
I think, you know, the UK was always first among equals in Europe. in terms of our allies. I think both France and Germany are becoming more equals with UK in different spheres. I would point particularly to counterterrorism with France, and with Germany in areas of stabilization and kind of coalition operations more broadly. But I think we'll have, you know, sort of at least 3 big European partners, and then several middleweight partners who always punch above their weight. You know, many of the Nordics, the Dutch, the Danes, and others. So I mean, again, I think when we paint them all with this brush of, oh, they're all free riders, it's completely fact-free. I mean, it's just not representative of what's actually happened since 9/11 in terms of their participation in Afghanistan, their participation in other operations of common concern.
And nor the sacrifices that they've made.
Absolutely.
I want to ask you about Turkey. Everybody is concerned with, you know, there are broad concerns about President Erdogan's crackdown. Obviously, a coup, it's in response to the coup, but folks are saying that this goes well beyond sort of a response to the coup and perhaps has a deeper agenda to it. Turkey is a strategically important ally to the United States. It's a key member of NATO. What can the United States and its allies do to try to help stabilize Turkey or help influence the course that Mr. Erdogan is on, that almost everybody, perhaps with the exclusion of Mr. Erdogan, regard as being very, very bad for Turkey?
Yeah. Turkey is an incredibly important strategic ally. It's sort of, you know, it sits between East and West. It is critical to the counter-ISIS fight. It's critical to all the work that we're trying to do in the Middle East. It's critical in terms of getting a handle on both the migrant and terrorist challenges in Europe. And yet I agree with your assessment. I think you have a democratically elected leader that's using his power to systematically try to, you know, reduce freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and enhance the power that is sort of he's amassing in his office. And so I think the U.S. needs to have some very frank conversations with Erdogan about why this trajectory is not good for Turkey, first of all. I mean, you could imagine driving Turkey into something that comes close to a civil war eventually, particularly with the PKK. You could also imagine really rough times with Turkey within the alliance and with its relationships with Europe, which are pretty important to both its security and its prosperity. So I think it's a good time for us as allies to be having some pretty frank conversations about our concerns and to also listen to him about his strategic concerns and where can we work together. But I think the road of the sort of anti-democratic consolidation of power is very problematic. First and foremost for Turkey and its future, but also for us as allies.
And his flirtations with Russia.
Yes, yes. Although I think some of that, you know, some of that's theater, some of it's, you know, the sort of bedfellow of the day. I don't think there's a lot of love lost between Erdogan and Putin.
Russia is one of the most vexing security challenges. It's a nuclear state. It openly talks about its nuclear capabilities. It has many divisions parked on NATO's borders. It has become embroiled and involved in complicating Syria, for example. It invaded Crimea and large parts of eastern Ukraine, where it continues to reside, continues to actively try to destabilize Ukraine and almost every other nation in the region through its proxies and Russian populations and fellow travelers, if you will, in all those capitals. You know, there's a cyber hacking incidents in the United States, the DNC hack, the Democratic Party hack being one of them, and there are folks who, you know, say like, look, there's going to be many, many more things that are going to come out timed very awkwardly, whether it's about the Clinton Global Initiative or other things to try to embarrass Secretary Clinton and President Clinton. And there are some, even in Europe, who've told me on recent visits there that they look to Putin to somehow try to take advantage of this window before the election to and the distraction of Brexit and the migrant crisis to pull a fast one at a time of uncertainty as he has in the past. What is, in the immediate sense, are you concerned about that and of some sort of incident? But the other thing is, what is the strategic long-term way to deal with this power where sanctions seem not to deter him? And the economic trends in terms of rising oil prices would only give him more resources over time to execute a very unpredictable and disruptive global strategy.
Right. I think Mr. Putin is playing a weak hand, but playing it very well, using all of his training as a KGB officer. He's got a declining demographics, he's got declining economy. He's, the economy has a single point of productivity, which is energy. He's not playing a strong hand, but he has managed to tap into a sense of Russian grievance with the way Russia's been treated since the end of the Cold War. He's managed to sort of capture the imagination of his population by, I'm reasserting Russia's rightful place as a great power. I'm going to reestablish our sphere of influence in Europe. And I'm going to be doing it by flexing my muscle to ensure that no state on our periphery is not under our influence. And if NATO's expanding, I'm going to push back. If the EU is offering association agreements, I'm going to push back, and so forth. And I'm going to try to fracture the cohesion in Europe and give Russia more of a playing field. I think he's, as I said, he's very good tactically, but I don't think he has a strong hand in the long term. I think as a matter of policy for the United States and its European allies, I think the job number one is to reestablish a credible deterrent in Europe, to help Mr. Putin understand, where will he receive pushback. I think the defense of NATO and NATO borders and the ironclad nature of our Article 5 guarantee is absolutely critical in reestablishing that deterrent. I think it's one of the reasons why I've been so disturbed by some of the rhetoric coming out of one of the candidates on questioning NATO's viability, questioning whether the U.S. would make good on that foundational commitment. So I think we have to focus on this. But we also have to try to be creative in thinking about, how do we help Putin climb out of the tree? I would differ with you. I actually think sanctions have prevented even worse aggression in Europe. I think we need to try to press him on the full implementation of Minsk II to try to stabilize that situation and allow Ukraine to sort of get back on its feet again. I think the threat of sanctions is still very important to keeping that window open. But we have to think of ways of help. How does he climb out of the tree when he gets himself stuck up there?
Sort of this sense of a large Russian cat stuck in a very tall, awkward tree, and trying to help him down. But do you think do you credit the moves by NATO, both in Wales but also in Warsaw, as having that deterrent effect, where some, particularly the closer you get to Russia, are a little bit more skeptical about whether or not NATO's response has been strong enough?
Yeah, no, I think we're on a journey. I think we started with some reassurance measures. Now we're starting to build a deterrence posture with the battalions in the Baltics and Poland. I think this is going to be a multi-year process of really creating the capabilities, both in permanently stationed and on a rotational and regularly exercised basis, that communicate Russia, we're here, we're staying here. If you come across this border, you will immediately meet not only the country you're invading, but the United States of America and the NATO allies alongside us. And so you are taking on the alliance the minute you come across a border. At the same time, I think even more challenging for Europe is figuring out how to counter some of these unconventional approaches. The use of media and propaganda, the funding of NGOs and even political candidates and parties in parts of Europe. The the instigation of unrest among Russian-speaking populations in the Baltics and elsewhere. I mean, those sort of unconventional hybrid threats are even more challenging to deal with in some ways, or less straightforward than the sort of reestablishment of conventional military deterrence.
Speaking of that, China has been extremely effective at trying to exploit gray areas, use Coast Guard ships, for example, in ways that folks don't necessarily use Coast Guard ships, building of artificial islands throughout the region. And there are those who say that one of the reasons the Chinese have been moving as aggressively as they have is that if you look at the demographic trends because of a one-child policy, they feel that they have a window in order to recreate or reorder the map for the strategic long-term, which some people say in the near and midterm makes China even more dangerous of a power. Do you agree with that? And just as I asked you about Russia, what's the right long-term approach with China that is a far greater economic power with a far broader base, an important trading partner of the United States, and yet perhaps the single biggest security challenge for all of the Asia-Pacific?
Yeah, I do think that President Xi has a vision for China sort of rising as the dominant power in Asia, reasserting its sovereignty over historical claims that others would question, and sort of using its power and influence unilaterally to kind of de facto change the status quo and worry about what the rules say later, and abide by the rules when it's convenient, ignore the rules when it's not. The difference with China is that it is fully integrated into the global economy, and so it has to be concerned about a level of provocation or confrontation in the region that would actually upend stability and hurt its economic growth, because China's leadership has one singular objective, and that is keeping the communist power in power, the Communist Party in power. And they understand that to do that, sustaining economic growth at a certain rate is imperative, and they should understand that to get that growth, you can't have a war going on in the region or open conflict with the United States. And so they have to moderate their behavior. I think here again, having the U.S. present, reinforcing the rules-based order, bringing our allies and partners into that common endeavor, working where we can on areas of common interest with China, constantly reminding them that they're playing with fire in terms of their own economic and political development when they upset the security situation.
Thanks for joining us, and if you have any comments about this show or suggestions for future coverage, please email me at vmuradian@defaeroreport.com. And stay tuned to the Defense and Aerospace Report for the best in national security coverage with interviews with top defense and aerospace leaders worldwide. Follow us on Twitter @DefAeroReport and on Facebook on the Defense and Aerospace Report, and follow me on Twitter @VagoMuradian. Have a great day.